Of all the philosophical questions that have plagued man over the centuries, the one of where do we actually come from is the one that has been argued with probably the most fever and the most controversy. At the heart of this controversy is the idea of evolution as proposed by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin originally published this theory in his book, Origin of the Species, that was published in 1859. In order to talk about this a little in more detail, we have to understand or have some common language. The first off is, what exactly do we mean by evolution? Well, according to Darwin, evolution is what he considers it to be the accumulation of inherited changes within populations over time. So if you want to look at this in the most basic way, it's changes over time. That's all evolution is. It doesn't propose anything about creation. All it proposes is what happens to populations and how do they alter within given time periods. When we talk about a population, we're talking about a group of individuals of one species that live in the same geographic area at the same time. Now, the fact that this definition seems pretty basic, but there's some really important parts to it. First off is the fact that a population is individual species. They're all of the same species, which means that they are capable of interbreeding. They live in the same species or the same geographic area, and they live there at the same time. And if you look at the definition of species, you also have this idea of behavior, that they have similar structures, similar function and behavior. All of these are really important because to understand evolution and to understand the pressures that Darwin talks about in his book, we have to realize that these individuals must be subject to the same environmental pressures, that reproduction is an important part and reproductive success is an important part of evolution, and the fact that behavior is all part of it as well. So, even though we all associate Darwin with evolution, the whole idea of evolution was or has been talked about for centuries. Aristotle is one of the first ones to have on record a theory, and he believed that organisms were moving towards a more perfect state of being. And the most perfect state of being, of course, is one that's closest to God. We also know that fossil evidence shows that there are organisms that did exist on the world that do not exist today, and that some organisms have relatives or have counterparts that live today, and they are, in many cases, very different than their counterparts from millions of years ago in terms of size, shape, structure, function. So we have those things presented to us. In addition to that, there was a scientist called Lamarck. Now, he was actually not in Darwin's age, but it was very close to Darwin's grandfather, and it was something that was perpetuated in the household, if not overtly, at least part of their understanding. And what Lamarck proposed several years before Darwin was that animals become more complex over time. And they do this to get food and to acquire whatever basic necessities that they need. And he included things like behavior. One of the examples that's most common when you think about Lamarck is that, and the one example that he used according to the history books, was that you have a giraffe, and a giraffe stretches his neck to get the leaves on the trees. Now, as the lower leaves become eaten, the giraffe has to stretch his neck longer and longer in order to get leaves and to get all the food that he needs. And over time, a single giraffe's neck would have grown possibly 4 or 5 inches. Now, this giraffe, when it turns around to reproduce, is able to take these acquired traits, acquired during its lifetime and pass them directly on to their children. Therefore, when the baby is born, it already has a longer neck. And because it has a longer neck, it can reach those higher leaves. And during its lifetime, it might stretch his neck a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. So the basic idea here is that any changes to an animal's traits during its lifetime can be passed on to its offspring. So, for example, if an individual gets a tattoo, that tattoo would be passed on to its offspring. It's a change in its traits. Now, we know that this doesn't happen. Okay. But during the 1800s, prior to Darwin, this was one of the more accepted theories of the day. Completely surrounded Darwin is the whole idea of selective breeding. Darwin came from basically a large plantation, we'd call it a plantation, a large farm, where selective breeding was being done around him. Huntsmen were selectively breeding dogs to be better hunters. Farmers were selectively breeding vegetables and other types of plants so that they would get better vegetables. They would choose a trait that they wanted, and eventually, through generations and generations, try to maximize the expression of that trait. An example of that is what you can see in front of you with the plant varieties broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, purple cabbage, all of these turnips. All of these plants actually are related to each other, and they all come from wild cabbage, which was cultivated in Europe. And eventually, you see all these different species. Artificial selection in animals was quite the thing. And here what you see is a selection of a chicken with the types of feathers that you would find most commonly on the lower belly. These are the feathers that the chicken would use to keep its eggs warm. And normally you only find those on the bottom. Well, this animal has been selectively bred to have a mutation in which those types of feathers, those nice downy feathers, surround their entire body. One of the things that you can see here is because the feathers are like this, there's no way that this animal could fly. So in the wild, this animal would most likely be picked off pretty fast, and therefore this mutation wouldn't persist. But in the farmer's yard, if he's cultivating something like this, he's going to protect this animal, and you see the mutation exist and even strengthen within the farmer's population. Before Darwin went on his trip, and let's talk about some reasons why. First off, Darwin was very into nature and had a very overbearing father who wanted him to go into medicine. And in an attempt to kind of get away from not only his father, and this whole idea of medicine because he didn't like blood, Darwin decides to accept a position on board a ship as a naturalist. And this allowed him to get away. He was only 22 years old, old enough that he knew what he wanted to do, but not quite old enough to go against his father. So this trip kind of let him have some breathing space to develop what he wanted to do with his life. As he went on the trip, he brought with him 2 books. The first one being the Bible, of course, because he was a very pious individual. The second one was The Principles of Geology by Lyell. Now, the Principles of Geology gave Darwin an understanding that the Earth, the physical appearance of the Earth, has changed over time due to some sort of geological process. We know, or he knew, that islands are created with volcanic action. So what this gave Darwin was the idea, in addition to that, Lyell also had an understanding of, or calculated, the actual age of the Earth. And when he calculated it, he calculated the Earth to be a lot younger than what was originally thought. Now, because of all these things came into play, there came the idea was that the Earth was too young to have so many different species unless there was some sort of mechanism influencing that change. The other idea that Darwin took with him was one of Thomas Malthus. He was a foremost biologist, and what he focused on was population growth. And what Malthus found was that population growth isn't always desirable. Now, he wasn't a very popular person with this idea because at the time people were all, go forth and prosper, do exactly what the Bible says, populate as much as possible. What Malthus said, though, was that it isn't always a good idea to go forth and populate because eventually we could run out of food. Population growth, if it's done without any checks, is able to proceed at a geometric rate. This is that J curve that we talked about in the last chapter. Food supply, however, Malthus found, was only able to increase arithmetically. So at some point in time, the population outstrips the amount of food that is available to him. So when the population outstrips its food supply, growth will decline. Why? Because individuals will start dying off due to starvation, or they will not get enough food in order to maintain, and eventually diseases will start picking them off. So this gave the understanding that resources that are needed by all populations may be limited. So let's talk about the voyage. It began in England, eventually went down went south, went around the eastern coast of South America, up the western coast, and then eventually they hit the equator where they proceeded west. And there you see here, went to the Galapagos Islands. They stayed there for quite a while. And then proceeded to go west, Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, stopping along the way at all sorts of small islands that are in the South Pacific, many of which are volcanic in nature. This allowed Darwin to gain an understanding of the creation of mountains due to volcanic activity, which he also published, and he's not as well known for, but he did publish that when he got back. But in addition to that, when you look at islands, one of the things that islands have that mainlands do not is that they are separated from other areas. And in some case, like what you see with the Galapagos, these individuals that are on this island are too far away from the mainland to be able to go back and forth. Even the birds, it's too far for them to fly back and forth. So there is no migration to and from the island. The animals that live here have been living here in isolation from all other areas. That's a really important part of the theory of natural selection. So on his travels, he came up with 4 basic observations, and from those 4 basic observations, he came up with several deductions. The first one being, like Malthus, he saw that each species has the ability to produce copious amounts of offspring. Examples of this would be a salmon can lay 28 million eggs in one season. Oysters, 100 million eggs at one single time. An orchid can release 1 million seeds in one lifetime. Each species is capable of overproduction. Yet, why are we not overrun by these species, by all these individuals? What Darwin saw was that populations stay relatively constant. Population growth is limited. It's limited by resources: water, space, food, shelter. All of these entities are limited factors, and therefore they keep the populations at a constant level. And for them to be able to keep the populations at a constant level, what that would mean is that individuals that are out there are competing with each other for these resources. So there exists a struggle for survival where individuals and or populations are competing for these various resources. The ones that win are the ones that survive. The ones that lose don't reproduce. Within a population, there is variation, and this is one of the key factors in the process of natural selection, is that in a population you see lots and lots and lots of different traits. Now, all of these snakes that you see in front of you are from the same species, yet if you look at their markings, their coloring, it's all slightly different from each other. Even two that are the same color are going to have just slightly different markings. And each of these markings might give it some sort of advantage depending on what environment it's currently living in. Finally, differential reproductive success. What this basically means is that individuals that possess the most favorable variations are more likely to survive. The ones with the better traits are the ones that are going to be more likely to survive long enough to reproduce and pass those traits on to their children. So from these 4 observations, what Darwin came up with is his process, a process of selection called natural selection. In a nutshell, this is what natural selection is. First off, within a population, there's variations in traits. And so in this fun little cartoon that you see here, here is a population of beetles. I have green beetles and I have brown beetles. Now, in this green beetle population, the brown trait comes up every now and then, probably some recessive trait or a mutation, and you see them there. Now, the selective process here is predation. I have crows, and the crows prefer the green beetles. They will not eat the brown beetles, but they will eat the green beetles. Now, we also know that these beetles live in an environment in which they are competing with each other for food. And so they have 2 pressures, one coming from the crows and one coming from the limited resources around them. As time goes on, the crows will eat the green beetles and will avoid eating the brown beetles. The brown beetles will have a greater differential reproductive success than the green beetles because they live longer, and if you live longer, you're more likely to reproduce. Well, over time, what will happen is that the brown beetles will be more reproductively successful than the green beetles. And you see there goes a shift in the population from brown to green. In the top population, green definitely outpaces or outnumbers brown. In the middle slide, after several generations, now we have brown and green about equal in the population, equal in frequency. And over time, if the selective pressure of the crows in eating the green beetles still exists, over time what will happen is the number of green beetles every time they are born, they get eaten, and therefore less likely to reproduce. When you look at this, or when we look at this, what we look at here is something called level of fitness. The brown beetles had the advantageous trait, and therefore they had a higher level of fitness than the green beetles. So, in Darwin's day, the press, whom scientists all love, watered down his theory to basically say it's the survival of the fittest. And that phrase has been kept throughout the years. However, it's very limited in describing exactly what evolution is all about. Evolution isn't about or necessarily about survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is basically a three-sided coin, if you can think of it that way. First off, traits of individuals that are beneficial to that population will definitely increase over time. So, in that sense, survival of the fittest is correct. Advantageous traits will be selected for, and those individuals are going to be the ones who survive and reproduce. But natural selection also gets rid of unfit traits. Individuals with unfit traits, ones that are selected against, are less likely to reproduce, and therefore will, in their frequency, will leave the population because they are unfit. But the one thing that the press with this idea of survival of the fittest doesn't address is neutral traits. Neutral traits are traits that are either not selected for nor not selected against. This is part of the variation within a population that you see. Now, just because a trait is neutral today doesn't mean it'll be a neutral trait tomorrow. A great example of that is HIV resistance. Now, if we didn't know anything about HIV resistance, then individuals with HIV resistance, they could exist. They can exist all over the world. And it wouldn't be something that we would worry about because we weren't worried about HIV. But now that HIV is around and it's something that is very detrimental to the population, those individuals who are HIV resistant, that is a beneficial trait, and they will be selected for because of that. If HIV was rampant throughout the world, worse than what it is currently, what you would see is that those who are not resistant to HIV would eventually succumb, and those that are resistant to HIV would live longer. Another example of that you might see is with the Black Plague. Now, the Black Plague decimated populations in Europe. Those individuals that were resistant to coming down with the Black Plague or acquiring it were able to survive. In addition to that, there were some individuals, although very few, that were infected and survived. All of us from Europe, are most likely to be descendants of those individuals who were either resistant to the Black Plague or were resistant to infection or were able to survive the infection. Neutral traits, though, are very interesting to follow. And one of the things that many people argue against is various traits. Why does this trait exist if natural selection's in place, if evolution's in place? Well, one of the things that you can look at in a population are these neutral traits to see and use it kind of as a basis for whether or not evolution of other traits or the selection of other traits is taking place. And we'll talk about that more in class. So to wind things up, let's look at our definition of evolution. Changes in the genetic composition of a population, populations, not individuals, with the passage of each generation. So again, we have this idea that reproduction has to occur for evolution to occur, and that within the population, there's a change in the genetic makeup of that population. Darwin didn't know anything about genes, although he and Mendel did live at the same time and both published during the same time period. Due to communication or lack of communication in the era that they lived, neither of them ever knew of each other's theories, nor had they ever met each other. Many scientists of the day were part of the gentry because in order to get any sort of publication done, you usually had to fund it yourself. And Mendel had very little money. He was just a poor little monk, and he was able to get some money to publish, but his publication was very limited. And so if he knew about Darwin, there was no record of it, nor was there any record that Darwin knew about Mendel's work. The almost 50 years had to pass before a scientist from England got a hold of a paper that was Mendel's paper and put the two ideas together. And that's what we're going to talk about next.